Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are doing a deck tech for Sab-Sunun, Luxa Embodied. Sab is a reach, trample, indestructible 6/6 for 5 mana. Sab can't attack or block unless it has an even number of counters on it, and at the beginning of your first main phase, put a 1/1 counter on Sab. Then, if it has an odd number of counters on it, draw 2 cards. This is just a bunch of Simic, draw, and counters. So, why play Sab? Because she's keyword soup. Indestructible reach trample is no joke, and indestructible is honestly one of, if not, like, the best keyword on a commander, other than maybe hexproof. And she's such a cool build around for a deck. You're able to add counters for what you need, right? Like, we have no hand, we set her counters to odd, and we go for big draws. Or we have a good hand and we don't really need a ton of action, then we can set her counters to even, and we can get a big attack with this massive, like, whatever trampler that'll kill with commander damage. There's also so many different counter options to pick from because Simic really just has the best counter options. Has so many of the best, like, really just there's so many good, at least all of the best ones. Cards that care about counters are just green, right? And blue has a good amount of utility to really work with it. Simic is just no joke. So here's the game plan. We don't need her to win. She's super cool for drawing and just kind of, you know, making a massive body, but, like, we're still just a counter deck. We don't necessarily need her to win. So early game, we want to set up counter engines and just really ramp rocks, anything like that. Mid game, we want to play Sab, and then we kind of want to set her counters to odd. We just want to make sure that we're drawing the turn after. That's the really only awkward thing about her, is she kind of takes a turn to do stuff. So when we want to set her counters to odd, and then late game we want to set her counters to even for big attacks, and then beat down with a ton of value generating creatures that are going to be massive because they have a ton of counters on her. When I say when we set her to odd and set her to even, we have so many cards that just will put a counter on her, and even some that will remove a counter. So we kind of just have the options to pick and choose what we need. So the channel and deck stuff, the deck costs about $490 at the making of this video. But as always, you can take some cards away. I do want to say really quick, this is a bracket 3 deck. Thanks, new commander rules. This is a bracket 3 deck. It's really not. I mean, like, it has 2 cards in it. It has Rhystic Study. It has Cyclonic Rift. That's kind of it. So if you want to make the deck lower, you can probably save like $60 or so. Just cutting those 2 cards and making it technically a bracket 1 casual deck. The bracket system doesn't make a ton of sense. I'll make another video about that. Doesn't matter. Get the cards you need from the link down below, and then as always, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Going into it, we have no Planeswalkers, but we have Bristly Bill, Spine Sower. Just really, whenever we drop a land, we put a counter on something. Like, these are the kind of ways I'm talking about how we set up counters. Like, if we have her on the field, like, we just don't want to have, like, her in a vacuum, right? Sab in a vacuum is we go to our turn, and then we put a counter on her, and then we draw, and then we go to the next turn and we put a counter on her, and then we don't draw, and then we attack. So that's how organically she's supposed to work, but we don't want her to work organically. We want her to do what we want. So ideally, we always have odd counters on her early game until she's big enough where we just start beating down. Bristly Bill is a really great way to make that happen, just by passively adjusting her with 1 counter, and then also paying 5 mana to double all counters on all creatures will straight up end the game as a good combat trick. Champion of Lambhole is a 1/1 with creatures with power less than it can't block creatures you control, which sucks because basically everything's a 1/1. But whenever another creature enters, put a counter on it. Therefore, you know, she'll get big. We're also going to put more counters on her, so functionally, she makes our team unblockable. Chasm Skulker, is he the best card? No, but boy, do I like him. Whenever you draw a card, put a 1/1 counter on Chasm Skulker. Then when he dies, create X 1/1 blue squids with Island Walks, where X is the number of counters on her. I'll call Chasm Skulker her. I don't know why not. It's just good. It's just kind of a big body, and then eventually when this body dies because it'll be too big of a threat, it kind of replaces herself with a bunch of 1/1 kind of sometimes unblockable dudes, which is great. Evolution Sage, whenever a land enters Proliferate, which is just not double up, but add an extra counter. Evolution Witness has Adapt 2, which kind of can enable itself, and then whenever 1 or more counters are put on Evolution Sage, return target permanent card from our grave to our hand, which is really, really good because we can just, again, with cards like Bristly Bill, put counters on her, or even like we have a land into the play, and then we proliferate, and then we put another counter on like Evolution Witness, and then we get another card back. It just kind of goes nuts. Fathom Mage has evolved, not super relevant for the deck. I mean, it'll be good to start it off, but generally, we're going to go with like Bristly Build type effects of like, we're going to put counters on this in an unnatural way. Whenever a 1/1 counter is put on Fathom Mage, you may draw a card. We're probably just going to draw cards. So we're just going to make her big. We're just going to start putting a ton of counters on her and make her massive and draw a lot of cards. Win-win. Flux Channeler is basically the best friend of, oh my god, what's the name? Evolution Sage. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. Great, tremendous. We have a lot of creatures. We have more non-creatures, so really good. Forgotten Ancient just gets passively massive. Whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a 1/1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and then at the beginning of our turn, we may move any number of 1/1 counters onto other creatures, which is really good because we do that on our upkeep, right? So Sab triggers when we go to the main phase. So even if we're like, yeah, we want to dump all but one counter, or like all but like no counters on the Sab because we'll go to our main phase, she'll get a counter, and then we just want to keep drawing. Late game, it'll be massive, and then we just go nuts. Big beater. Giggling Skitterspike. I just love this card. I have it in so many decks. It's just so cool. Indestructible 1/1. Whenever it attacks, blocks, or becomes the target of a spell, it deals damage to each opponent equal to its power. The idea is, imagine like this combo with Forgotten Ancient and Giggling Skitterspike. We put a ton of counters on Forgotten Ancient because players are casting spells, not just us, but players are casting spells. We go to combat on our turn, put it all on Giggling Skitterspike. Giggling Skitterspike is now like a 10/10. We attack, everybody but us takes 10. Someone tries to blow them up, everybody takes 10. Great. Gyre Sage is basically the same thing as Fathom Mage. Evolve doesn't really matter. We're going to put counters on her other ways, but we just cap it for a green for each counter on it is really good. It's like a super mana dork. Herald of the Secret Streams is really good just to make our whole team unblockable. Incubation Druid taps for 1 mana, just a little mana dork, but if it has a 1/1 counter on it, she'll end up tapping for 3 mana instead. So this is kind of good. Where like, imagine, I don't know, turn 2 we play Incubation Druid, and then turn 3 we play Bristly Bill, and then we play a land for turn, and then we put a counter on Incubation Druid, and now it taps for 3 right away. So really good, and then it can enable itself, make itself a 3/5. Colonian Hydra, when it enters with 4 counters on it, and then whenever it attacks, double the number of 1/1 counters on each creature we control. The cool thing about doubling is it doesn't really mess with Sab's counters because we're doubling it. Like if we double an odd number, well, I guess it kind of does matter because if we double an odd number, we'll probably get an odd number. If we double an even number, we're gonna get an even number. Either way, right? We have so much fixing, it'll make our whole team massive, and like, it's just good. Kian, Corrupted Memory, that's just an illusion. Power is even, you may cast non-creatures as though they had flash. Power is odd, you may cast creatures as though they had flash. Whenever you draw a card, put a 1/1 counter on her. She's honestly like just an alternate Sab, a little bit worse Sab in my opinion. I don't know, I like Sab a little bit better. Functionally, they kind of do the same thing, but also not really. Kodama of the West Tree, 3/3, 4/3, with reach. Great dude, great dude. Modified creatures you control have trampled. Modified creatures, forget equipment, forget auras. Counters are modifications. All that matters. Whenever a creature with a counter on it deals combat damage to a player, search your deck for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped. Sounds good to me. Just good ramp. Managorger Hydra is just a different version of Forgotten Ancient. Trample, whenever a player casts a spell, put a 1/1 counter on it. This dude just gets massive. Like, the idea is we want to have Sab be big, but really, honestly, for Sab, we don't care if Sab's like super big. She's good for commander damage, but we're using Sab for utility. Like, ideally, Sab is drawing us 2 extra cards every single turn, and then eventually, when we need our late game to be a big beater, we swing out. Managorger Hydra is just always going to be that big beater. Master Biomancer, each other creature enters the battlefield with additional 1/1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power, and it's a mutant in addition to its other types. In a nutshell, or a vacuum, I guess, Master Biomancer is a 2/2. Another creature enters, that creature enters with 2 counters on it because his power is 2. Late game, when we put a ton of counters on it, let's say we have like 10 counters on it, and it's a 12/14, every creature is now going to enter with 10 counters on it. Ornery Tumblewag is probably the most ornery of all of Magic's brush wags. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. Great. When it attacks while saddled, double the number of 1/1 counters on target creature, and then saddle too. Really, the main reason we're using them, the simplest reason we're using them, just put a counter on a creature at the beginning of combat on our turn. So, which is really nice if we want to be like, okay, we want to draw cards with Sab, and now we want to put a counter on Sab, and we want to attack with her because she's big. Ornery Brushwag will do that. And then when we attack, we can double the number of counters, which is also kind of cool. Pier and Toothy, the dastardly duo, they have partner with one another. Basically means when one enters the battlefield, you can tutor the other one up from your deck to your hand. Pier, if one or more counters will be put on a permanent your team controls, that many plus one of each of those kinds of counters are put on that permanent instead. A double-edged sword, mostly good. Kind of rough, because -1/-1 counters are now doubling up, so kind of awkward, but generally it doesn't matter too much for us. He just puts an extra 1/1 counter on everything, which can be awkward with Sab, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We have a couple cards that remove counters, because you're like, well, you would think, well, why don't you just add counters? Because sometimes we have a lot of cards that double counters that make it so even if we add an extra counter, it actually adds 2 counters, and it doesn't actually work. So sometimes too much of a good thing can be bad. Toothy is just a big unit. Whenever you draw a card, put a counter on it. When he leaves, draw a card for each counter on it. The leaves is a really big deal, really just because, like, a lot of these guys, like Chasm Skulker, for example, she has, when she dies, but Toothy, if he gets bounced or exiled or, like, killed or whatever, right, you're still drawing a ton of cards. Polywog Prodigy, and also with Toothy, we still draw a lot of cards naturally because we have so much card draw in this deck with like Fathom Mage and Sab and even Polywog Prodigy, which has Evolve. Again, don't worry about Evolve. It's good, but like mostly like a lot of the guys on our deck start small and then get big. Polywog Prodigy has Evolve, but whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than his power, draw a card. So the idea is we're probably just going to put him at like 3 and let him chill unless like we have unnatural ways to, like, I don't know, like in unnatural ways, like we proliferate and we hit everyone, but we're probably not going to target him individually anymore after a certain point. So basically whenever an opponent casts a non-creature, we're just always going to draw. Railway Brawler, reach, trample, 5/5 for 5. Ooh, I love power creep. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put X 1/1 counters on it where X is its power. So it basically like doubles things up. So Selvala, for example, is a 2/3, and she will then, with Railway Brawler, enter as a 4/5. He also has Plot, which can be really good. I feel like plotting him is almost always the best option when you can. If you're in a pinch where you need a blocker, don't plot it. Or if you have a ton of mana, don't plot it. But like if it's turn 4 or whatever and you got nothing going on, plotting him's not that bad. Selvala is an absolutely massive mana dork. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. Hopefully, that's probably not going to be us a lot of the time, I'll be honest, but her mana power, like if we play cards like Railway Brawler, like a 5/5 is pretty big. But if we tap her, add X mana of any color combination where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. At the very worst, it's just our natural mana dork. Pay 1 to get 2. But if we have like a big Sab or a big creature with like Mana Gorge or a Forgotten Ancient, like we'll be like, yeah, we'll just add like 15 or whatever. The 20-toed Toad. Your maximum hand size is 20, which is basically no max hand size. Reasonably, that's no max hand size. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, put a 1/1 counter on 20-toed Toad and draw a card, which is pretty good. Then, whenever he attacks, you win the game if there are 20 or more counters on it, or you have 20 or more cards in hand. We do a lot of both of those things in this deck. We draw a lot of cards, and we put a lot of counters on our things. Is he the best card? No. Is he a funny card? Yes. Is he bad in the deck? No, he's pretty good in the deck. Like, objectively, like, he's pretty good. Are there better options? Probably. But I like cards that say win the game. Vorl is good. Double the number of each kind of counter on target artifact, creature, or land. The idea is we basically, like, attack with a creature, and then Vorl says, haha, it's twice as big, and our opponent dies to that. If we attack with, like, a 10-10 Mana Gorger, we're like, oh, it's a 20-20 now. Cool. This is fun. Vorinclex is just a mana doubler. If you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many, so we double up all of our counters. And then if an opponent would put a counter on something, but they put half that many counters, which is cool because if they put 1 counter on something, they put no counters on something because it's rounded down. Zamek Guildmage is like a good necessary evil, right? Like, we don't want to remove counters, but when we have cards that only double, if we need to have like an odd or even on Sab, these like cards like Zednik will fix it. Pay 2 mana of each, this turn each creature you control enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it, or you can remove a 1/1 counter from a creature you control and draw a card. Like, these are the kind of cards where if we have cards like Vorinclex, for example, where since we're doubling it, it's only going to be even, we're never going to get that extra card draw. Zenmik's always good just to be like, oh yeah, we'll just pay 2 mana, remove a counter from Sab in response to her trigger, and then we'll draw 2 cards or do whatever. Also, just removing one counter from a creature to draw a card is not bad. And the final creature we have is Zimone, Paradox Sculptor. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures you control, and then pay 2 mana and tap her just to Voral. Usually, you're just going to put a 1/1 counter on her and something else, and then she's a big mana doubler for a big funny swing, which is good. Going into sorceries, we have Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits. Nature's Lore and 3 Visits are the same exact card. Search your deck for a forest card, put it on the battlefield. Farseek does basically the same exact thing in this deck, but Farseek is always going to enter tapped, whereas the 2 cards we're going to grab, right, is either, if we need untapped red or blue or green mana, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, get like an untapped breeding pool, right? Or if we're doing nothing else, get a tapped hedge maze. Farseek is probably always just getting hedge maze or breeding pool or just like a random tapped island, right? Either way, Nature's Lore has more upside, but Farseek is still very good. Triumph of the Hordes is a big finisher in the deck. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1, gain infect and trample. And because our creatures get so big so quick, we don't need too much to really kill someone. Just like the extra +1 and trample, if we have like even like a 10/10, which is, it sounds silly, like, oh, we have a 10/10, like, it's very easy to get a 10/10 in this deck. Sab starts as a 6/6 and then turns into a 7/7 if we don't do anything about it. She'll swing in for 8 infect just right there. It's a great way to end the game, at least kill one person. Wave Goodbye is just a little board wipe. Return each creature with no 1/1 counters to its owner's hand. Ideally, all of our creatures have counters on it, and if they don't have counters on it, it's probably like just a value creature. Or, I mean, I feel like almost all of our creatures are going to have counters on it, in most case scenarios. Going into instance, we have Beast Within to pop a permanent we don't like. They can have a 3/3 Beast, no big deal. Counterspell is a good counterspell, probably the best counterspell in the game, at least one of them. Maybe not Mana Drain, but oh well. Counter something we don't like if it bothers our board. Cyclonic Rift is probably the best, according to the brackets, one of the most powerful Magic cards of all time. Overload 7, because we probably don't want to do a singular bounce unless we're really about to lose the game, but generally we just want to pay 7 mana, do a one-sided board wipe for the most part. Apparently it's just the best card in the game. Growth Spiral, draw a card, put a land from your hand onto the battlefield at instant speed. It's card draw, it's ramp, we draw it early game, great. If we draw it early game, great. We draw a card and then ramp. Late game, we cantrip itself. Heroic Intervention and Inspiring Call are functionally here for the same reason, just to give all of our permanents indestructible until end of turn. Heroic Intervention is good because it gives them all hexproof if someone tries to like exile something, like spot exile something. Inspiring Call just gives them all creatures with counters indestructible, at least our creatures with counters on it indestructible, and then we draw a card for each creature we control with a 1/1 counter on it. So even if someone tries to board wipe, we'll draw a bunch of cards and our guys gain indestructible, or at the very worst, we'll just draw a bunch of cards if we need to. Mutational Advantage. Permanents you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to those permanents this turn, and then proliferate. Mutational Advantage is kind of if Heroic Intervention and Inspiring Call had a baby, and it's Mutational Advantage. Ripples of Potential. Proliferate, then choose any number of permanents you control that had a counter on them. Put this way, those permanents phase out. Basically, it's the same thing because if we proliferate, all of our things already had a counter, so basically everything with a counter on it phases out, and we proliferate really quick. So again, if someone tries to wipe the board, or if someone tries to do whatever, we can just kind of say, see ya, and then phase out for a turn. Solidarity of Heroes is a fun little combat trick. Choose any number of target creatures, double the number of 1/1 counters on each of them, and then we can just strive for more. So at the very worst, we just double one creature for 2 mana, or we can pay 4 mana to double 2 creatures, or 6 mana to double 3 creatures, and so on and so forth. Going into artifacts, we have Arcane Signet just because it's a good rock. The Ozolith, if one or more counters would be put on a 1/1 counter, if we put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1 are added. Basically a little counter doubler. Not a doubler, but like if you put one, you get one. It's a buy one, get one free kind of guy. And then for all intents and purposes, at sorcery speed, you can pay 2 and tap it to put 2 1/1 counters on a creature or artifact you control. And then it has cycling for some reason. I'm not complaining it has cycling, but it does. It just does. Doesn't make it any better. I guess it makes it better. It doesn't make it any worse. It's got cycling. Power Conduit is a good example of like a remove a counter card. So remove a counter from a permanent you control, choose one. Put a charge counter on target artifact we control. I'll tell you we're not doing that. Put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. So the idea is we can remove a counter from Sab before she does her like main phase thing if we want her to draw or if we want her to be a beater. And then we just beef up another creature. Or if we have any of those kind of effects like Ripples of Potential or Mutational Advantage, and we're like, hey, that dude doesn't have a counter on it. Let's take 1 counter away from this creature and give a counter to that creature, so when we do our little dodge a board wipe, that thing's safe too. Either way, that's good. Simic Signet and Sol Ring I'm not going to talk too much about. They're really just mana rocks. Swiftfoot Boots is to put on Sab just because we don't want people interacting with her. Or if we just want to just give a creature haste if we got like a big stinky creature right away. Swing out, go nuts. Talisman of Curiosity is a rock. The Great Hen should never cost that much mana. Honestly, turn 5, like very legitimately, turn 5, we play Sab. Sab's a 6/6. Go to our next turn. She puts a counter. That's a 7/7. Great Henge costs 2 mana. Pays for itself with its first tap ability. Sounds good to me. Pay 2 mana. Sorry, tap it for 2 mana and 2 life. And then whenever a non-token creature enters under the battlefield under our control, put a counter on it and draw a card. Pretty solid. The Ozolith is such a great card. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. Like leaves, I'm talking like if this thing dies, gets blinked, exiled, put into the grave, shuffled into the deck, thrown off the mat, sent to a different store, doesn't matter, right? Those counters are going on the Ozolith. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, if it has counters, you may move all counters from the Ozolith on the target creature. So basically, like even if we get board wipes or one of our big dudes gets killed or whatever, those counters are still saved, go straight on the Ozolith for 1 mana, and we just put it all onto something else at the beginning of combat on our turn anyway, so still pretty good. Thought Vessel, just a mana rock. Giving us no max hand size, I think, is pretty relevant in this deck, so I wanted to add that as a rock. Just we draw a lot of cards. Thunderous Velocipede, trample each other vehicle and creature you control enters with an additional 1/1 counter on it if its mana value is 4 or less. Otherwise, it enters with 3 additional counters on it. So, a creature enters the battlefield, if its mana value 4 or less, enters with a counters, or if it's a big dude, enters with 3 counters. We play this on turn 3. Sab enters as a 9/9. Sounds good to me. We're probably not growing it. It's more just for the effect. Going into enchantments, Branching Evolution and Doubling Season for all intents and purposes are the same exact thing in this deck. If 1 or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many are put on it instead. Kind of the same deal with Doubling Season. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens, create twice that many. If an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent we control, put twice that many. I mean, they're different cards, but for all intents and purposes in this deck, they're the same thing. Fight Rigging has Hideaway 5, which means when it enters exile, or look at the top 5 cards of your deck, exile one of them face down under Fight Rigging and put the rest on the bottom of your deck in a random order. Then, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Then, if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So the way we run this, right? Turn 3, we drop it down, exile probably the biggest or best thing we can out of the top 5 cards of our deck. Eventually, hopefully turn 4, we play Sab. Sab is a 6/6, go to combat on our turn. Sab is now a 7/7. We control a creature with power 7 or greater. We get to play Sab, and we get the free exiled card just for fun. Guardian Project, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, draw a card. It's just good. Hadana's Climb, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. If it has 3 or more counters, transform it, and then it turns into this cool land that taps for any color, and then we can pay 3 mana and tap it to have target creature you control gains flying and +X until end of turn, where X is its power. So it's pretty cool because, like, again, late game, or even whenever, we just give a creature flying until end of turn. Go nuts, this thing's massive and now it has evasion. Sounds pretty good to me. Hardened Scales, just a little, you know, if one or more counters will be put on a creature you control, put an additional one. It's a buy one, get one free effect. Innkeeper's Talent going straight down the list is great. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control. Beautiful. That way, like, those kind of effects are really good. Again, Sab, we play Sab, it's a 6/6. Go to our next turn. Sab has an odd counter on it. We draw 2 cards. Put an extra 1/1 counter on it with like Innkeeper's Talent. Now Sab is an 8/8 trample reach that can attack. Great. Permanents you control with counters on them have Ward 1. Sounds good to me. And then 4 mana. If you would put one or more count, it basically doubles up counters. It's like an actual factual double up counter effect. Very good. It just scales out. Rhystic Study, very similar to Cyclonic Rift, is probably the most powerful card in Commander because having Rhystic Study and Cyclonic Rift will turn your deck from casual jank pile garbage into very viable and competitive, regardless of whatever else is in it. I have a little gripe with the bracket system, if you can't tell. Either way, it's a great card. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, draw a card unless that player pays 1. Hopefully, we either tax them or we're drawing a card. It's a win-win either way. Simic Ascendancy pays 3 mana to put a 1/1 counter on a target creature you control. Whenever one or more counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. And then, at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has 20 or more counters on it, we win the game. Sounds pretty good to me. I really like that. I love Simic Ascendancy. Any card that says you win the game that reasonably works in a deck, I must always try to put in. Teferi's Ageless Insight, if you would draw a card except for the first one in your turn, draw 2 cards instead. So the idea is, with Sab, we're drawing 4 cards. So the idea with Sab is we're drawing 5 cards every single turn. It's kind of how it works out. We have a lot of other card draw with, like, I don't know, Fathom Mage or whatever, but we're drawing a lot of cards. Wizard class, you have no maximum hand size. When this becomes level 2, draw 2 cards. And then when it becomes level 3, whenever you draw a card, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. So I kind of like that, how it scales out. So we go to our turn with Sab, and then we draw 2 cards because she has an odd number of counters on her. And then we draw 2 cards. I guess she'll still be at an odd counter, but I mean, still she's a little bit bigger. We just add like an extra one through any of our many added counter effects. Either way, it makes our creatures massive because I guess we don't even have to put it on Sab. We just put it on other creatures. Doesn't matter. We draw a lot of cards, and now they're getting massive because we're drawing a lot of cards. Going into lands, we just have Breeding Pool, Command Tower, and Dreamroot Cascade. For the most part, all of these, just like a lot of the lands I add, are because they enter untapped. Breeding Pool is fetchable. That's kind of why Breeding Pool's in here. Hedge Maze is also fetchable, just because with Farseek and 3 Visits and Nature's Lore, we can just kind of get it tutored up if we need it. Hinterland Harbor, almost always an untapped dual land. Karn's Bastion lets us proliferate at instant speed. Nesting Ground is great because it removes a counter or adds a counter by paying 1 mana, only as a sorcery, so you can't do any crazy tricks with it, but still good nonetheless. Rejuvenating Springs almost always enters untapped. I build these decks assuming we have pods of 4 with 3 opponents, so it's either entering untapped or you're in a 1v1 at this point in the game. It doesn't matter if this thing enters tapped or not. Reliquary Tower to give us no maximum hand size because we do draw a lot of cards in this deck. Rogue's Passage to make a big stinky creature we have unblockable. Scavenger Ground is there to exile a graveyard in case we have a pesky Reanimator player. Willow Rush Verge, it's an untapped duel. I don't know. It's just because it's in the same set Sab's from. It's not bad. Like, it's good. But I don't know. It's on flavor. Why not? And then the final one is Yavimaya Coast, just because, again, it is an untapped dual land. Going into basics, we just have 12 forests and 10 islands for like a total of 35 lands. I also really like the Sab islands. At the making of the video, right, those bad boys are $7 each. I mean, if I'm playing this deck, I'm getting all my islands to be Sab. Like, if all my lands feature my commander, it's gonna happen, right? Either way, we do a lot of like basic tutoring, say with like Kodama, and it's fine. We're a 2-color deck. We don't need anything too crazy. We're Simic, we ramp, we draw cards, we do all that. That's all I got for you guys. Thanks for watching. Get the cards you need right from the link down below. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And as always, I will see you guys next time.